This is a Film Stories original podcast.
We made this.
Hi, my name's Chris Owens. I played Jeffrey Spender on The X-Files, and I'm happy to be talking on the X-Cast.
Hello everyone and welcome to the X-Cast. The truth is in here. I'm your host for this episode, Kurt North, and I don't think it'd be any surprise to anyone who our guest is going to be, as he's put in plenty of what's the best way of putting it? Plenty of little thoughts and has instilled in people's minds through regression hypnosis that he wants to be on this episode, and that would be our good friend Darren Mooney. How are you doing, Darren?
Careful planting. It's all been a careful conspiracy building to this particular moment, Kurt.
Yeah, we are talking. We're going to be talking about the season 5 episode Patient X, and then next week we're looking at the Red and the Black, which should be fantastic. So this week we're looking at Patient X. The episode itself was written by Chris Carter and Frank Spotnitz. It was directed by Kim Manners, and it aired on the 1st of March 1998. It is the 13th episode of Season 5, and this episode sees the introduction of Chris and Cassandra Spender, a return to Skylar Mountain from Season 2's Ascension, a follow-up on Alex Krycek's Tunguska and Terma episodes, the introduction of a mysterious group upsetting the plans for colonisation, and more directly, we catch up with Mulder's now-found scepticism from the Redux trilogy. So, just before we go into that, we as always, Darren, look into the IMDb score, and it's always a pleasure when you're on and I get to do this with you. So, out of the IMDb rating, where do you think this would lie in the world of IMDb and the X-File fandom on that particular website?
Okay, now I haven't looked at the score for this episode, but I know from doing Redux 1 and Redux 2 that those were among the highest placing episodes of the season, which would lead me to believe that this is in the top 10, but not necessarily in the top 5. So I'm going to go with an 8.7.
Not quite. Your ratings have been really good this season, though, haven't they? You've been a couple out. 8.4 this was.
Overestimated it and underestimated Redux. Darn it.
Yes, but you're getting there. By season 8, I think. Having said that,
the money.
Yeah, exactly. That was from 2,296 votes. Now, what are your general thoughts on Patient X just on its own? As I say, we'll be looking at the Red and the Black next week, but Patient X, as it stands on its own, sets up a lot of things. I mentioned there a few things like Cassandra and Chris Spender's first episode, and it touches on a lot of what's gone before, which is different to the way that season 4 picked it up on. So what would you rate it out of 10, and what's your general thoughts going into it before we look at the episode in further detail?
Yeah, rewatching Patient X and the Red and the Black is kind of interesting because collectively they are my second favorite mythology episode. Like, if you watch them back to back, they're a 10 out of 10. But it's an interesting case where I would argue that the sum of the whole is greater than the individual parts, because I think that this is a 9 out of 10 for me. And I think that not to spoil next week, but next week necessarily won't be a 10 out of 10 either. But I think if you watch them back to back, the two-parter is a 10 out of 10 for me, just in terms of everything coming together and working perfectly. But the individual elements, I think, maybe don't necessarily work. They work very, very well. A 9 is a very generous score. But they're just a little bit shy of perfect, and then they work together perfectly. And in terms of this episode in particular, and you're right, I absolutely love the kind of the laundry list of things that you came into. and what's really great about it is that, like, it's not only is this like a laundry list of stuff that the X-Files is doing now at this point in the 5th season, and you're quite right that it is a laundry list of stuff that is very different than the approach that they took during the 4th season, because during the 4th season the mythology was kind of, not to be too cynical or too cold, because I really, really like, Tempest Fugitive and Max. But in the fourth season, the mythology was largely kind of treading water. It was growing outwards rather than upwards, if that makes sense. It was kind of, there was a sense that they'd arrived at a point and they were trying to figure out where they were going next. And there was a lot of kind of holding patterns and adding more details in, but no real sense that there was like a forward momentum pushing it onwards. And what's fascinating about Patient X, in particular, is the sense that you have immediately out of the gate a sense of everything coming together, because you have everything happening here from Marita Covarrubias to Krychek to the well-manicured man. You also have the introduction of new elements, you point out, like Cassandra, Jeffrey Spender, but you have a sense of things kind of cohering. You have a sense also of like the conspiracy moving along. So this idea of an alignment between the Russian conspiracy introduced in Tunguska and Terma with the American one that we've been watching almost since the get-go, but at least kind of formally from the end of the second season, through to the present point in the show's run. But what's absolutely amazing, what I adore about this two-parter, and it's probably something that I suspect a lot of people find really frustrating, is that it arrives late in the fifth season, where the show is gearing up for X-Files Fight the Future, the big blockbuster summer release that's coming this year. Carter has, he wrote it more than a year ago at this point. He filmed it during the previous summer break. He knows exactly what's coming down the pipe, and all he's got to do is just set these things up. He's just got to line everything up so it leads perfectly into the film. And there are aspects of the Red and the Black that do that. There's this element of the vaccine. There's the elements of like the well-manicured man who's introduced in there. But there's also elements of Patient X that are introduced that are completely off the board in terms of Fight the Future. And you get a sense watching it that like they're not outside Fight the Future because Carter didn't want them there. They're outside there because they're great ideas that occurred to him after he'd written and filmed the feature film and was like, I'm not going to wait a year to put them in. I'm just going to introduce the character of Cassandra and Jeffrey Spender right here, right now, because it makes sense. Never mind the fact that they don't at all fit or integrate in the movie that I've kind of, set up or launching into the summer. And I absolutely love that. There's an energy and a kind of a verve and a sense of momentum in these two episodes that has been missing, I would argue, probably since Nicey and 731 in the second half of the third season, if not slightly earlier. There's a sense of like Carter being, and again, I really like Gethsemane, I really like the Redux trilogy, I really like Tempest Fugitive and Max, but there's a sense that, with the mythology, Carter hasn't been as propulsive or as energized in the past couple of seasons. And all of a sudden here, there's just this incredible spurt of energy that is infectious and just propulsive. And I adore it, and I'm really glad to see it.
There's an element to this episode. I mean, I've always found this particular episode, Patient X, a struggle, and I'm sure that many people will have anyway. But over the years of rewatching and giving it a bit more leeway and factoring in the season arc and various other elements as well, that I actually have come to adore it more. And I think you're definitely right with the propulsiveness. It's kind of, you were mentioning about season 3 and the likes of Piper Maru and Apocrypha and 731 Nicey, where you've got this propulsion of, the literally on a train, going down a train track at, 17 miles, 18 miles an hour, and there's a bomb on board. But this has the same kind of elements to it, but more of a visceral reaction. And I'm going to pick this up a bit more in the deeper context when we get into the episode, especially with the opening credit scene, which we'll talk about shortly. But the reason why I was saying that it's taken me a while is that Mulder's attitude has always been an issue for me within this episode. That there's lines where it's where he's really kind of just not there, and he's been a bit of a dick to Scully. He's been a bit of a dick to people on a panel, and
he's behaving like a stroppy kid in detention at the panel at the start. It's like watching The Breakfast Club.
Yeah, exactly. But the more that I watch it, the more that I actually really appreciate the aspects that Chris Carter and Frank Spotnitz were putting in, where it does freshen the show up, and it does bring it back to, I would argue, Tunguska and Terma is almost like a leap back to that episode. And, we do have Emily and Christmas Carol early in the season, which, again, we'll pick up on as we get into the episode. But it does feel like there's a renewed vow of, like, we are coming to the end of the season. What are the reasons for this renewedness? We don't know. But, there is Fight the Future coming, and yes, there is there's elements within the show that don't cover the film, and I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. And I'm sure that when the Fight the Future information comes out in the near future, when we cover Fight the Future, that we'll delve into some of the reasons why, or some of the reasons of not having, likes of Krychek in there and the rebel aliens and whatever. But yeah, it just feels like it's just a refreshedness about it, and that it's a great. It just has this great kind of visceral feeling to it, and it feels like it's back on form, and that's the way I generally feel about this episode. The two parts especially. I would agree with you that this one and the next episode, that I think that this one does a lot to move the chess pieces on the board, really, and it's quite ironic, or it's not lost on me that the end literally has a chess game at the end of it, which is always quite fascinating to me. But there is this element that we are at least moving forward again, whereas in the past few episodes of the mythology, we've definitely feel like we've stalled, and that's kind of where I am with this episode.
Yeah, and it's also kind of worth noting in that sense that I think, you were wondering where that propulsive energy came from coming into this two-parter. And again, I don't know, obviously never asked anybody involved with it or talked to anybody involved with it, but there's the, discussion Carter had at the start of the fifth season when he was writing Redux 1 and Redux 2, where he discovered that the mythology was effectively, sort of self-inventing and self-reinventing to a certain extent. And you can kind of see that energy here where, Patient X and the Red and the Black are arguably, they're not just about pushing the mythology forward, they're about also tying it back. It's arguably the greatest antecedent of these these two stories, aren't any of the kind of mythology stories that we've been doing since we've had, the conspiracy or the consortium or the kind of the well-manicured man involved in the show, or, any of those characters. They arguably tie back to Colony and Endgame in the second season, and kind of that fascination, that thematic engagement with the idea of the alien and the divine being interwoven, and kind of finding a way to tie those themes. And again, this is probably why I think the two-parter, not to talk too much about the two-parter in the Patient X episode, but it's very clear from the opening sort of scene where Mulder sort of has that monologue that I think is one of the great Chris Carter monologues in the show's run. But you see, one of the things why I think the two-parter works better than a lot of mythology episodes is because Carter finds a way to tie his big existential philosophical ideas about the nature of mankind and the role of faith and belief, and kind of wed them to, and again, this is obviously, I suspect this is Frank Spotnit's influence on the script, but wed that to the kind of propulsive, forward-moving sort of again, literally bomb on a train in Nicene 731 setup. So you have the best of both worlds. And you can see it even from the outset in Patient X, where you have Mulder's opening monologue about, the belief in God and this idea of the war in heaven, on earth as it is in heaven, as above, so below. And you have that immediately juxtaposed within the teaser, with this shot of people running round screaming, of fire, of destruction, of death, of Brian Thompson with his face completely covered over. And you have everything that I love about the X-Files mythology essentially wrapped up in these two episodes, which is why I think it works so well, and why I think a key to why it feels both so kind of aggressive and propulsive and sort of blockbuster in the style that we've become accustomed to in terms of these episodes, but also why there's a sense that there is something underpinning it that runs, and again, not to, harp on Tunguska and Terma, but something that kind of something to underpin that level of blockbuster action that I don't necessarily think was there in episodes like Tunguska or Terma.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned the main monologue at the beginning, so I think that we should maybe dive a bit further into that, and we'll take the episode and look at it in more depth as well. So let's go do that now. I'm interested to see that you mentioned Brian Thompson there. Did you take that as Brian Thompson as one of the alien rebels then? Because because I've often thought that was Brian Thompson or looks familiar to like Brian Thompson. A lot of the actual alien rebels themselves do kind of appreciate that or kind of look that way. Did you think that or?
I did think that. Is it not Brian Thompson in that scene? I thought it was. Sorry, that's my bad. But
yeah, I've always thought they look like it, but I just in the context of the narrative, whether or not that would actually be, because he's actually then later on in the Red and the Black actually sent
as
to
himself without the face covered.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think that's the thing. And not to worry about talking too much about the specifics of the Red and the Black, but there is this sense that the implication is that the faceless men and the bounty hunters are maybe related to one another in terms of, you know, again, if you want to get sort of specific and nitty gritty in terms of the mythology, the idea that maybe they are from the same species or from the same clone batch or from the same sort of like primordial origin. Because I've always seen, like, I know there are scenes where there are two of the faceless men, and obviously one of them is Brian Thompson and the other is not. The other is... I'm trying to think, there was a really odd comparison that sort of jumped out at me, and I can't remember now which actor he reminded me of. But it was a very strange experience. It's like, hey, somebody pasted over Tom Cruise's face. It was not Tom Cruise. But it was Brian Thompson.
It would have been quite interesting.
Quite a get in 1998. But it would have been, but there is this sense... I've always kind of assumed that they are the same species. That they are the same sort of... And obviously... Because obviously the alien bounty hunter that we see throughout the show isn't always the same alien bounty hunter, because some of them die, and obviously they have different agendas and stuff like that. So my reading of it has always been that the alien bounty hunter is several different alien bounty hunters that just happen to look like Brian Thompson as a default form. They've sort of settled on that for like when they're on Earth. Now you could ask, like, again, this is one of those things where you don't really want to wonder, do they always look like Brian Thompson even? Do the colonists in their natural like non-black oil form, or is life seeded across the galaxy, does it happen to default to looking like people even when it can change forms? In which case, is it kind of strange that there are a bunch of shape-changing aliens out there, but it just so happens that their default form is exactly identical to us? But I mean, it works rather well as shorthand for illustrating that these are Brian Thompson is X-Files shorthand for evil alien. And Brian Thompson without a face is also shorthand for, mysterious alien who is probably also evil without a face, which I think works relatively well.
When I was younger, it always bugged me that it looked like a bit like, it looks like the bounty hunter, what's going on? But bearing that in mind, we see things in later seasons, don't we, as well, where in one of his last appearances that, we see multiples of him and things. So, but but going back to the very beginning, where you were talking about the voiceover that Mulder has with the exploration of space and the deities, and which one do we look at? Do we look at how best to look at them? We see old eyes or new eyes. That Chris Carter at this time is obviously going through some kind of sort of epiphany in some ways, that he's having these ideas that we'd eventually get into the biogenesis kind of fold with this, and he'd look into it in more detail there. But then we've also got some of the visual things that we're getting, and I'll bring this up now because obviously we've both been on the Time Is Now podcast, and without going into too much detail, but there is the visual cues that are very similar. I mean, what did you think to that, and the obvious comparisons with Millennium at that point, but also some of the thoughts that Chris Carter's obviously having, which will then go on to play in future seasons?
I mean, several things on that, because I mean the first thing about Carter is that he is a great recycler. And again, you could argue that, again, this is not just recycling ideas from Millennium, it's also recycling ideas from, like, the second season of The X-Files. Like, you have this idea that runs throughout Patient X, and most obviously, like, in Mulder's opening monologue, but then you have Cassandra delivering a monologue, almost immediately after that point as well, after the Kazakhstan scene, where, she's also outlining the idea that the alien and the divine are one and the same as well. But that's an idea that the show's been playing with since the second season, and not just, obviously, in, Colony Endgame, but even in episodes like, for example, Red Museum, or even like you wanted like Fearful Symmetry, which is probably the last time that somebody on this podcast is going to reference Fearful Symmetry, although probably the only time somebody will reference it sort of vaguely affectionately. But you have this idea, like, throughout Carter's work of the aliens as divine authorities. Like, I mean, the walk-ins in Red Museum, where they're almost presented as kind of spirits or kind of guides or as a, something to be worshipped in a religious sense. In Fearful Symmetry, they're like Noah preparing an ark for the flood. It's at that stage it seems like Carter hadn't quite settled on the idea of colonization, or at least hadn't settled on the firm idea of what colonization was going to be. And there was, watching Fearful Symmetry, you'd almost believe the aliens are benign, that they're rescuing the animals before we as mankind horribly mess up the earth. Which again, interestingly, is an idea that Carter comes back to just much later on in the show's run. This idea of like aliens being like, well, you humans have made a mess of this planet. But like you have Carter kind of like never putting aside a good idea and always kind of playing with it and always kind of tweaking it. And you're right when it comes to Millennium. And it's fascinating because you have the sense of, like, Carter was obviously showrunner on the first season of Millennium. On the second season, he didn't have the time to do that because obviously he was, filming Fight the Future during the summer. He was doing post-production on it all through the year. In fact, actually, one of the reasons why Rob Bowman couldn't direct The Red and the Black and why Carter had to step in was because Bowman was actually still doing reshoots on Fight the Future at that point in the season. So you had, he had to hand over, the second season of Millennium to Glenn Morgan and James Wong. And it's one of my favorite seasons of television ever. But you can almost tell that, Carter's ideas and preoccupations and things that had interested him, he's ported them over. And you can argue that, again, this is just turnabout as fair play, because there's a lot of the X-Files in the first season of Millennium. There's a lot carried over, from episodes like Irresistible or Grotesque examples. There's a lot of kind of imagery that does carry over in that sense. And here you have a number of images that are lifted directly from the first season Millennium. There's that, the stitching of a man's eyes and face and mouth and nose shot, which is a horrific image. It's a nightmarish image. I think that was a Television Without Pity voted, Dimitri. Not the flaming, bodies screaming through the night. Not the faceless men, but Dimitri with his eyes stitched closed, his mouth stitched closed, his nostrils stitched closed, as one of the most horrific images in the history of the show, and deservedly so. But that, again, is taken from the pilot of Millennium, where the Frenchman does something similar to his victims. But there's even, obviously the image of Men on Fire, which is also taken from that pilot episode where Frank has a flash of somebody on fire running through the woods, which is a nightmarish image, but that image, again, is repurposed here. And obviously with the X-Files, it's not just a quick flash anymore. It's delivered on a blockbuster budget where they had a stuntman in a special suit, on fire for 30 seconds while they shot those scenes, which is terrifying to think about. It gives a kind of a sense of the scale of production in which they're operating there. But even thematically, I would argue, the core ideas of, Patient X and The Red and the Black, and I'm, not to keep talking about the two of them as one, I know we're talking about Patient X this week, but the core idea that's carried over and is articulated by Mulder in his opening monologue, which is this idea of a war in heaven, is something that Carter had really kind of seized on late in the first season of Millennium, with Lamentation and Powers, Principalities, Thrones, and Dominions, which, for listeners who are not familiar with Millennium, those are just 2 episodes. But yeah, so it's the late season 2-parter. It's very similar to Colony Endgame. And in fact, I would argue that you can make a War in Heaven trilogy by watching Colony and Endgame, then jumping over to Millennium and watching, Lamentation, Powers, Principalities, Thrones, and Dominions, and then hopping back to the X-Files and watching Patient X, The Red and the Black. And the idea of a war in heaven, just in case any listeners are not familiar with the term, or at least how I'm using the term, because obviously there are different ways of using it, and I don't want to assume that I'm correct. I'm not an academic in this sense. But it's to refer to this idea from Milton's Paradise Lost, which is the idea... and Mulder does an excellent job articulating it in the teaser anyway, but the idea is that there are forces that exist beyond mankind's capacity to reason and understand. And those forces are primal, existential, and maybe even ideological in nature. And that they clash and they fight on a plane which we cannot comprehend, which exists beyond our capacity to understand. And again, that's a discussion that comes up at the panel later on, where you have the expert, after watching Cassandra's sort of testimony, argues, and I'll try and find the line here, but he says that, it's not a question of truth versus fiction, but of truths which are incomprehensible. The idea of the war in heaven is that, when angels clash in heaven, they exist beyond anything that we would term as physics, anything that the human brain is capable of comprehending. And I mean, if you want to pick an example from like contemporaneous culture, think of Dogma, the Kevin Smith movie, which is a very odd example to pick. But you have like Metron, the voice of God, who jokes that, you know, he had to be appointed the voice of God because the human mind cannot comprehend or process the sound of the voice of God. The great line, we got through 4 atoms before we figured that out. But the idea of the war in heaven is that there are these primal conflicts happening that we don't understand, and that those echo and reverberate in our lives in ways that we don't necessarily always comprehend. And again, I don't think like literally there is a war in heaven, but I think that it's a nice metaphor for some of the facets of the ways in which we live, in which our lives, and again, I worry I'm going to sound very New Age. I'm going to sound very Mulder. No, I'm not going to sound Mulder-esque. I'm going to sound Reyes-esque when I talk about this. But the idea that, you know, when we're living our lives, that a lot of the factors, a lot of the stuff that happens to us isn't necessarily down to things that we understand. That people make decisions, and those decisions ripple, and they have consequences. They have consequences that we are not even directly aware of, but they affect the flow and the course of our lives in ways that we don't necessarily fathom. And again, you can make any number of obvious kind of metaphors or parallels there. You can suggest, you know, things like, you know, the meeting of your parents, which is obviously something outside of your control, but which led to you existing there. But even things like, you know, whether or not you got a job and why you did or didn't get that job and what happened as a result of that. But the idea that, that human lives exist, you know, in chaos, which is a very powerful thematic idea and something I find very fascinating. And it's something Carter plays with kind of throughout his writing. And he plays with it, you know, in Colony and Endgame, where you have the idea that, you know, Mulder's loss of Samantha is tied to something that is much bigger than just the disappearance of, you know, a girl from Martha's Vineyard. And in Lamentation and Paris, Principalities, Thrones and Dominions, you have the idea that Frank Black is witnessing a war between powers that exist beyond his comprehension. And he can, you know, he sees a flash of light. Is it a gun, or is it something, you know, more powerful or more kind of like the hand of God at work? And, you know, even here you have the idea that, you know, something strange is happening and nobody has any idea what it is. And throughout Patient X, there's this question and the sense that even the conspirators don't understand what is happening or why it is happening or the forces that are at work. And I like it. And again, this is one of those things where I wonder if I give Carter too much credit, and if this isn't actually a clever thematic idea, but a really, really clever Weasley way of writing the mythology of a show like The X-Files. Because, I mean, oh, you'd never understand it is a really great cop-out as a writer when it comes to like working with a mythology like this. You know, it can be a really good HP kind of Lovecraft sort of like, oh, there are forces that exist beyond human comprehension and to even gaze upon them is to go mad. But it's also a really nice way as a writer who's written a show for 5 years and has no idea when it's actually going to write or wrap up to go, there's probably answers out there. We never understand them, so why bother looking for them? But I do think, like, absolutely sincerely and absolutely honestly, while you can be cynical and look at it that way, I actually do find something very clever and very affecting about the way in which the show uses that idea, because obviously that reverberates through, you know, the idea that like Mulder's family trauma is indistinguishable from, you know, the vast conspiracy between, you know, the cigarette smoking man and the colonists to destroy mankind, which is itself then tied up in an even bigger conflict, as we discover in Patient X and the Red and the Black, which exists so far beyond our understanding that it's practically meaningless. And I really like that idea, as pretentious as I've just made it sound.
Well, I think that you're right, though. I mean, because people who are going to be writing in this purple prose way, especially with the voiceover and the elements that he throws out there. Yes, you're right that sometimes when he gets an idea, he wants to get it out there as fast and as repetitive as possible. And I mean that in a good way, that these ideas will come, but they come at different angles in various different forms. So we would take the Biogenesis trilogy, for example, and he has those thoughts that he wants to put down on paper, and he has very thought-provoking monologues. Now, we can argue all we like about Mulder's monologues or whoever uses them, even Scully's monologues or whatever, but the majority of them are actually really, really defined. Well, not defined, but are thought-provoking, and you really want to like sort of delve into what that potentially means or how you could potentially view the episode. There is also obvious ones when he's saying he's driving left out of a car park, out of a hospital in a Ford car, but that's slightly different. But yeah, and it gives you context, and in this way for the opening, I think it definitely gives you that context. And I think we'll pick up more on obviously what the actual development of the war in faction is with the alien rebels once we move into the next episode for next week's episode. But it does give you that opening chapter or prologue in some ways that this is what we're talking about now. All manner of things are going to change. The universe is going to be expanded so much more in this episode, and it's all thematic. And when I talked to Carl Sweeney on, I think it was we did the top 10 best mythology episodes that we considered to be the top 10, that this was in there for that reason, the fact that they've expanded the universe so much, and we'll get into that in the next episode. You mentioned also as well the discussion that Mulder's involved with, where he's on the table with all these experts, and he's obviously being invited on as a guest for his work. And this is something I wanted to pick up on the fact that only 4 seasons ago he started off with a really bad, I think it was MF Luda as his acronym, and now he seems to be these people that are starting to follow him and starting to really appreciate how or what Mulder's done. We can talk back to Cassandra Spender saying about the Dwayne Barry issue, and now he's that in there that he's actually on a panel now. There is elements within this panel that I wanted to get your opinion on and what you thought, how you thought that the whole panel went, and we're going to talk about Mulder's general attitude, as I say, the brat attitude that he does have. But there is elements within this where he does not state that he doesn't believe in aliens themselves, only what he's been led to believe were, and there is an element of truth in it. What did you think of the actual panel scene? Well,
first of all, just kind of one of the interesting things about it is like that MF Loader thing that you mentioned, which is the idea of using an alias and kind of being anonymous to avoid getting drawn into this sort of stuff. But I think, and again, this ties back into what I think Carter was doing with the whole Mulder skeptic arc with Redux and Redux 2, is a sense in which like Carter is dealing with the legacy and phenomenon of the X-Files, because it was coming in for criticism for the idea that the X-Files was popularizing or mainstreaming sort of conspiracy culture, and it was encouraging people to indulge the beliefs that people don't necessarily subscribe to as being true. And you had people like Richard Dawkins arguing about it. You had people like Carl Sagan arguing it. And I suspect that one of the reasons why, say, Patient X treats Mulder as a celebrity, rather than, obviously being a bit more grounded in its treatment of Mulder as a, representative of the US government in a situation where we're talking about alien abductions, is I think to allow the show to play with that idea. Because Cassandra quite literally says, the events of the episode of Dwayne Barry, not even like, that case involving Dwayne Barry. She's like, no. He held hostages in a travel agency. It's like, she's like, either Cassandra Spender has got Jeffrey to kind of sneak out X-Files for her to read, which seems highly, highly unlikely. Or she's been watching Fox, on Friday nights and been tuning into the continuing adventures of Fox Mulder. But there is the sense that that Cassandra is a stand-in for some of the people that, maybe Dawkins was concerned about or that Sagan was concerned about, who had kind of embraced without questioning some of the ideas proposed by the show. Instead of doing what Carter wanted the show to do, which was to encourage a healthy skepticism and a kind of like a wariness or a kind of critical thinking with regards to this sort of stuff and, kind of accepted wisdom, just embracing these ideas wholesale. So I think that you treating Mulder as a celebrity kind of allows Carter to play with that idea in the context of the episode. Although, yes, I also agree that, Mulder, don't be a dick about it. You didn't have to accept the invitation to the conference if you were just going to sit there and roll your eyes and tap your pencil. There's a moment where it almost looks like he's going to lean back in his chair and go, whatever, man. At one point interrupting them. And it is interesting. I actually think that there's something very clever there. I think you picked up on it exactly, which is the idea that Mulder doesn't. And again, this is a really weird sentence. Mulder doesn't not believe in aliens. Mulder, doesn't he does disbelieve, but he doesn't refuse to accept the possibility that aliens might exist, which adds an interesting kind of complication to it, because he's not an atheist, so to speak. He's just an aggressive agnostic. Which is a slightly different approach or angle than we'd kind of been given to expect, with Redux 1, Redux 2, and arguably even like Chris Carter's The Postmodern Prometheus earlier in the season. It is a bit of a wrinkle, and I wish, and again, this is one of the things with the 5th season as a whole, where I understand why this is, because that's how the X-Files worked. So, everybody was allowed to write their own episodes, and if those episodes relied on the traditional dynamic, as episodes like, say, Bad Blood did, for example, then there was, no reason why, the writers or staff would have to kind of, write Mulder in a particular way. They could all use their own unique version of Mulder, but at the same time, I do wish that we had seen more of Mulder's kind of skepticism, more of Mulder's kind of crisis of faith, so to speak, because you're right. That is a huge detail to throw out there. The idea that Mulder isn't just firmly and blindly rejecting aliens. It's that he's rejecting the idea of the aliens that he's seen to this point. He's still open to the possibility, which is, it takes me longer to say that than it does for, Mulder to actually give his answer, or than the show devotes to exploring Mulder's answer, which is a bit of a shame, because there's a lot of great material there. And it is a bit of a shame because we know, or Carter knows at least, having actually written and filmed the movie, even if nobody's seen it at this point, that by the time he gets to the end of the season, Mulder's going to have to believe in aliens again, because Fight the Future is going to be an X-Files movie for a mass audience, which means Mulder's going to be the believer and Scully's going to be the skeptic. So it is a bit disappointing the show never really got to develop that as much as it might have.
Emily does an interesting job in keeping Mulder, you're right with the word agnostic, that he's not as full on as he is here with his denials and his attitude. I think his attitude is probably my issue that I have with it. But in Emily, for example, he's still talking about the over experiments, and that Scully was abducted, and that it was men, and Emily focuses particularly on the doctors that are involved and what happened to Emily and the ongoing issues of Emily. But it's very careful not to tread a line either side. So we do have that element. But one thing I would like to kind of pick up on with regards to Mulder, I think Mulder's probably something that we need to discuss now, really, is that throughout the episode, there is really some really bad lines that he does actually say. I think there's one where he's saying, "Do you have evidence of that?" "No, I'm going to give you an explanation." Or, Mulder saying that she's removed her brain. Why are you tiptoeing around it? And all these.
Or even the bit where he tells Cassandra to leave, no matter what she's afraid of, and just walks out of the room. Yeah,
I'm not as well when it's I'm not. But I thinking back to Redux 2 with the episode, during that episode we see Samantha, and then we see what we believe to be Samantha, and Mulder, I would suggest, takes that at face value because of his newfound belief that we're still getting these things processing. Dr. Verba mentions in that scene that do not think of my work, and Mulder saying it's not your work, it's what I was led to believe, which is purely a reference to Redux 2 and the fact that he believes that he has seen Samantha at that point. And throughout this episode, it almost feels like he's going through some form of PTSD in some ways. And if you view it from that viewpoint, I think you can get around some of these seriously off-putting things, but I'm not sure whether or not how much of that was involved in the writing, or whether or not it was designed to purely get you. You're saying about that celebrity status, but more of that visceral reaction from the crowd to be able to flip it by the end of, as I say, end of season 5. So, what did you think of Mulder overall during the course of particularly this episode, with regards to those sort of elements that he's been doing over that episode?
Well, I suspect, just to go back to Emily and Christmas Carol and stuff like that, I suspect that one of the reasons why Mulder is characterized slightly different there is because that was written by the John Gilnett's team, wasn't it? Siobhan Gilligan and Spotnitz. And so they understandably probably have a different emphasis on Mulder than Carter does. Whereas Carter... and again, this is one of those things where, I've talked a bit about Gethsemane and all those other episodes. There's a sense that Carter felt almost kind of personally wounded by the criticism. Not personally wounded, that sounds very melodramatic. But he was understandably upset by some of the criticisms of the show for, embracing paranormal or the supernatural, or kind of like rejecting critical thought. And there's a sense in which the way that he writes Mulder, and, particularly in, say, Gethsemane Redux 1, Redux 2, but also in The Red and the Black and Patient X, is almost like a kind of a spiteful, well, you want a skeptical Mulder, I'm going to give you a skeptical Mulder, and you're going to be feckin' happy for it. There's a real sort of sense of... And again, you see that almost with the introduction of kind of Spender here, Jeffrey Spender, where Spender is introduced as an analogue to Mulder, in that obviously, I don't want to get a reputation, and you're like, what, spooky Spender? But also even things like his, there's the allegations of abduction, the idea that his family was broken up by alien abduction, much like Mulder's was, and, not to jump too far ahead, but kind of Red and the Black goes all in on those kind of comparisons. But the idea is that Spender, even here in Patient X, is introduced as Mulder without any drive, or without any passion, or without any ambition. And that's largely what this seems to be. And I think you're right about PTSD. Mulder has had something taken away from him, which is like fundamental and essential and a large part of who he is. And he has been traumatized by it. Like, it's telling that, when, Scully remarks that he looked constipated and he's talking about how he had his head up his ass, as much anger as Mulder has for other people. And it's actually really nice. I really, despite how much of a jackass he is throughout the episode, I quite like that he takes a moment when Werber kind of says, well, I'm sorry you think that about my work, that Mulder actually has a moment of compassion and says, I'm not actually criticizing your work. This is entirely about me. And I almost wish that he'd had moments like that with, say, Cassandra, or even with Jeffrey, or even with Scully.
Well, actually, I would argue that he does with Jeffrey, because there's the scene towards the end when he says the prophet. Now that's a bit of a leap with that one, because he does,
it seems almost sarcastic,
yeah. But then right at the very end, he says that we won't be bothering anymore, and he actually goes out and touches Spender's arm. Yeah. And I think that is kind of the empathic Mulder, the way that does kind of come through. Yeah. So there's still those little touches that are seeping through there.
Yeah, but I mean, even then, there's a sense that, like, who Mulder really hates in all this isn't the other believers. It isn't Cassandra, despite how rude he might be towards her. It isn't the other people with whom he's sitting on a panel. It's himself. When he gets that picture of himself, when Scully's like, oh, I thought that would, that should be my quote there. He immediately draws a little devil beard on himself, on this image of himself, which kind of gives you a sense of how Mulder sees himself at that moment in time. He is traumatized, but I think there's also an element of self-loathing, and it's hard to tell whether that self-loathing is, Mulder resenting himself for having believed for so long, or whether kind of almost subconsciously resenting himself for lacking the strength to continue to believe, which is one of those great little nuances and great little kind of character beats. I do think that, yes, he is far too acerbic here. He is far too... Again, he's like a moody teenager when you're watching that kind of, that kind of conference. And you're wondering why he would have agreed to go on there. Theoretically you understand that it's because he wants to publicly rebuke these, and he wants a forum in which he can criticize these beliefs and stuff like that, but it still seems very mean-spirited. for Mulder, for a character who is, as you pointed out, is largely defined throughout the show, by his empathy and his compassion for others. Even before Mulder, is the guy who believes in alien abduction. Mulder is the guy who generally empathizes with victims. You're thinking like Oubliette, for example, is a great example of that. And I mean, there are a lot of problems with Excelsis Day, but I would argue the most fundamental problem with Excelsis Day is that that is an episode that misunderstands Mulder's character to the point where there is no sympathy or compassion for a victim there. Mulder's completely lacking in empathy in that episode, and that's probably before you get to the myriad of other problems with it, the immediate "this episode is wrong" moment for me as a viewer. And yeah, I think that Patient X does skirt that. You're right that there's a sense of kind of setting it up for the heel-face turn, and I think there's also a sense of Carter maybe understandably feeling a bit frustrated and being like, there's that almost spiteful sense of, well, you want a skeptical Mulder? I'll give you a feckin' skeptical Mulder, as he types angrily on his keyboard. But yeah, I mean, I understand that it doesn't necessarily work entirely, and it does lean a little bit too far. I do think it gives Duchovny some good stuff to play, though.
Yeah, it does. And I think that, as I say, an earlier version of myself was I didn't watch this episode for quite some time, and I think the Red and the Black I'd seen quite a few times, but it frustrated me. And when he says no, I'll give you an explanation, I actually often swore at my TV. So I was like, I can't see that episode again. But I have got over that. I've got over that problem. So I'm just going to mention, let's bring in something else, another story element that comes in, which is the bringing together the Tunguska arc, and almost, you've mentioned yourself over the course of the X-Cast that the show tried to broaden itself out. And they brought in, it's a Mulder Goes to Russia episode, and the fact that this is kind of turning it on its head a little bit. It's bringing in a story element which is going to play out into the film. We're going to to a degree, lose the Tunguska element because we're getting Krycek coming back from there to American soil, and we have bringing the syndication into real focus here, even to the point where we've got the New York City area as well, the Gentleman's Club, with of course a lady in it, in Marita. So how did you think that all worked together with bringing that story element of kind of closing the Tunguska side down to a degree, but then also bringing the Marita and Krycek back in, because Krycek's someone that appears every so often in mythology, but he's quite well designed in that he's not in every single one, and I think that really plays out really strongly. But it is interesting how they're kind of closing the Tunguska arc down, really.
It is. It's kind of, there's a real streamlining going on here, and I mean, like, and again, I don't know what was happening precisely behind the scenes here. I'm not speaking with any real expertise, but it is interesting how you see the mythology kind of expanding hugely in, the third and fourth seasons. I mean, you have, like, not only do you have, the obvious example of the kind of like conspiracy in Russia and Tunguska and Terma in the fourth season, but before that you had like Mulder going to going to Hong Kong, for example, and you had the Japanese conspiracy in Nicey in 731, and you had this idea of basically this vast kind of, the syndicate that was kind of fracturing and that wasn't a single unified entity, which again becomes a big kind of thematic idea as we move into, Patient X and the Red and the Black. But it is interesting that you mentioned the kind of streamlining they're bringing back, because it does bring Krycek back into the fold. He literally sails from Vladivostok to New York in order to kind of like join the standard conspiracy thread. And again, despite the fact that, you could argue that there are certain elements of this episode that are set up to go in to fight the future, and not to be too spoilerific, but those elements are, the vaccine, to pick an example, and Mulder's journey back towards faith, to pick another example. But there are aspects of the episode that, don't necessarily, or even like the well-manicured man's sort of crisis of conscience as well also plays into the movie. But there are aspects of the two-parter and Patient X that don't play into the movie. But even those aspects of Patient X and the Red and the Black, which are the, introduction of the rebels, the introduction of Cassandra, the introduction of Jeffrey, those elements don't play into Fight the Future, but they do play into the direction that the show takes in its sixth season, most notably in the episodes Two Fathers and One Son. And there is a sense that I wonder if, like, Carter is basically And again, this is Chris Carter and Frank Spotnitz. This is the mythology. When you say getting all their ducks in a row, it is a relative term because there are always going to be open-ended kind of like dangling threads for the show to pull at and for fans to pick at. But I do wonder if there is a sense of like that being in play here in writing Patient X and the Red and the Black, because obviously you had all the stuff that was happening behind the scenes that wouldn't necessarily have been, a factor when they were writing and shooting the movie, which are things like, for example, Duchovny having reached the end of his 5-year contract, leveraging that in order to force the production to move to Los Angeles and getting involved in various pay arguments and disputes around the same time as well. So, there was an argument, a conspiracy theory. I don't know if there's ever been any conclusive statement one way or the other from the production team on this, aside from the denials in the fan press at the time. But there was some speculation that the character of Jeffrey Spender was being introduced as a possible replacement for Mulder. And you can tell, for example, the way that he's introduced to Scully is quite similar to the way in which, John Doggett is introduced to Scully when the production team actually have to introduce a replacement character for Mulder. He's more of a skeptic than Scully is at this point in her journey, for example. And, he's coming to her outside the framework of the X-Files, and then they have an antagonistic relationship because of a betrayal of trust, and that sort of stuff is at play there as well. And there is a sense that, maybe Spender is being introduced as a character who can fill a narrative void that would be left if, hypothetically speaking, Mulder were not available, for the 6th season. And so there is a sense in watching that kind of streamlining in Patient X and the Red and the Black that Carter is kind of casting an eye to the future in a way that the mythology hasn't always done so. Because the mythology has, and again, it is a long-form serialized storytelling arc, but generally speaking, the two-parters have stood relatively well on their own terms. You can watch Colony and Endgame by themselves and be relatively satisfied with that as a unit of story. You can watch, Nicene 731 or Apocrypha and Piper Maru as, effectively miniature feature films and be quite satisfied with them as well. Red and Black, Patient X and the Red and the Black don't necessarily work as cleanly in that fashion. I think they do, but not as well, because obviously they feed off, as I mentioned, in two different directions. One that heads directly into Fight the Future, and one that leads directly into the 6th season. What's happening, I think Patient X does an excellent job of paying off Mulder's observation in the opening dialogue of as Earth as it is in heaven. This idea that things that happen on a personal and intimate and even global level are themselves mirrored at a higher level, at a plane that exists beyond human comprehension. I think the episode does that rather well, because I really like the idea of humanity being so fractured and so unfocused and so at odds with itself that they, and again, this is one of those themes that has only gotten more and more relevant after the show has gone off the air. I would argue that like Patient X and the Red and the Black have aged remarkably well as mythology episodes go. But the idea that when mankind is faced with an existential crisis, that, you would think logically that everybody would come together and work to solve that problem because it's in their own interests to work together to solve that problem. But the inevitability, of the situation is that you have these conflicting interests and you have these, conflicting ideas and these personal priorities that inevitably get in the way. And so what you end up with is, instead of one overarching kind of narrative or conspiracy or story or structure, you have several competing interests that never manage to align perfectly. And you see that even within, Patient X, where the conspirators can't help but stab one another in the back. Krychek betrays his Russian masters in order to help himself. Covarrubias betrays her masters to align with Krychek, betrays Krychek to align with Mulder, and then ends up almost right back, where she started, not to get too sort of like spoiler about what happens next week. And it's a really fascinating kind of arc and element. It's also worth noting I really like that sequence of Covarrubias in the Gentleman's Club in New York. The way that Manners shoots that is really, really impressive, because it's just a scene of characters talking and sort of like conversing. But he he frames it in such a way as that even if you weren't aware of the fact that this is the first time you've seen a woman in the gentleman's club, it would still seem odd. She's still positioned at the center of the frame. She's still presented in wide shot. There's that wonderful wide shot of Quiet Willie, where he's in the foreground and everybody else in the background, but they're all arranged around Covarrubias as if she's a conversation piece, which really gets a sense of how alien she is kind of in that environment. And I think that's actually quite clever, because it gets at something that the show does rather well with Covarrubias, and I would argue also with Diana Fowley when she's introduced later in the season, which is it plays with this idea of kind of collaboration and this idea of compliance, because you have this idea, that the conspiracy is, obviously it's this idea of subjugation and, resist or serve or whatever, but it's this idea of, wealthy white men ruling the world, and you have like this tension that exists when characters like X are introduced, who's an African American, but he's operating much lower down the food chain. He doesn't enjoy the same protections that Deep Throat did, because Deep Throat is a wealthy middle-aged white guy who is like essential to this operations being run and is a key part to it. But you have even Covarrubias, who is like presented as a woman, and so is not necessarily party to the center of the syndicate. She's not a kind of a key player, and while she's also not protected in the same way that X is, there's other dynamics at play there, like her complicity, which is interesting. And they do the same thing with Fowley later on when they reveal that Fowley was watching the women in the mutual UFO network groups for the syndicate. You have this question of women, like, because one of the key angles of the conspiracy is the exploitation of women's bodies. You have, like, Cassandra talks about having a fetus taken out of her, and having her body subjected to experiments. Scully has had her body subjected to experiments, and had sort of parts of her harvested, and again, her reproductive organs manipulated and kind of controlled by the whims of men. And, it's not exactly a kind of a subtle metaphor, for, feminist concerns about, like, picture structures. And you have this idea with Covarrubias of the question of complicity. And, like, again, it's something that you, like, would say The Handmaid's Tale. You have with, is it Serena Joy is her name? But you have that character there who's doing something similar, where Covarrubias is a woman who is complicit passively in the oppression of other women and the exploitation of other women's bodies. And the way that her arc plays out in Patient X and The Red and the Black is fascinating, because she doesn't get protection. Her complicity does not buy her protection from the same processes and systemic abuses that are visited upon women like Cassandra and like Scully, and I think that's very clever. And again, I wonder if maybe I'm giving the episodes too much credit, but I do think it's something that the show gets at. And I think that even if Carter didn't write it, I think that Manners as a director here understands it in the way that he frames Covarrubias as, literally an alien, or literally in an alien environment when she's in that room with the men. At the syndicate.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, speaking of the syndicate, you're right. I did catch the centre frame, and it is off-putting because it's right in the centre, and I would never have thought of it in your terms, and that's the reason why you're on here. But the thing with the Mariti, I think you put quite a few good points there with the way that the narrative goes, in that there's all these weaving storylines, and you're saying that obviously it's aged quite well, and that when we look at what Krychek was initially planning on doing, that it didn't go to plan. But the whole story itself feels like it has been written with some authority and some real thought behind it, whereas in the past you might have got Krychek going off to do something, and you're not quite sure where that's coming from. But you do feel that this has all been, again, go back to that chess analogy, that all the pieces are kind of being put into place and moved around as they need them.
And the episode is actually quite surprisingly explicit, like in terms of exposition for an X-Files mythology episode. Like, again, there's a lot of like flowery dialogue and stuff from the well-manicured man and the people at the syndicates, but it's surprisingly nailed down. Like, you have that sequence in the room where they're talking about whether colonization has actually begun, and one of the elders says, "That's not for the next 15 years," which, by the way, neatly kind of sets up like when you get to the end of the show, the big revelation in the truth is that actually colonization is scheduled to take place 15 years roughly after the events of Patient X, which is a nice bit of foreshadowing. But even things like Krychek talking to the well-manicured man about the vaccine and like describing what it is and using words like the colonists to describe the colonists, it's very concrete in terms of laying out what it's talking about, which is quite nice, I think, and I think is very, like, it's about time the show allowed itself to be candid, because you're right when you talk about earlier on, you would have had Krychek going off to do something, and the show would have been very ambiguous about what it was, because they wanted to leave the door open to bring Nick Lee back in any context that they wanted. Whereas here, there's a real sense of, actually, we should probably be clear about what he's doing and why he's doing it and what his motivations are, in a way the show hasn't always been to this point.
And I like both. I do like things being ambiguous and thematic, or having your own headspace to fill in the blanks and to have conversational opportunities to be able to speak about what you think could be, the water cooler kind of idea, where you'd go into after the following week and you'd go into work the following day and talk about that episode and whatever. So I do appreciate that, but the refreshingness of that that explicitness in this is that it is refreshing and it is starting to formulate. And this is one of the things I was going to mention. You mentioned about obviously the syndicates coming together here, but it's not lost on me as well that the guy says 15 years, and that's kind of the date that we get. But also as well, the things that transpire in, and we won't go into too much spoilery detail here, but Two Fathers and One Son, especially One Son, that we're talking about the assemblies that are happening. We're talking about the Skyland Mountain, for example, that which I wanted to discuss next, where you've got these elements that have come into the show that have been here before, that you've got Ascension and Dwayne Barry in there with Skyland Mountain, right back here on Skyland Mountain, which is a great use, again, for Mulder being his dickish self, which is great. But also to give Scully that opportunity to start to flip her a little bit, to push the boundaries on where she's coming. And she has some great acting scenes in this where she's really struggling to say what she wants to say, and like you would say in season 8, where she becomes a lot more open to it, but she still struggles a little bit with it. But there's times where she's quivering with her lips, and just the acting skills of Gillian Anderson I think is incredible. But going back to the kind of almost the setting out the pieces here, I keep going back to this chess analogy, but for Two Fathers and One Son, that we are getting these elements of like the assemblies and Skyland Mountain, and obviously at the end at the bridge as well. Do you think that really worked and will continue to after the film goes into, once we get into One Son?
Well, I mean, it's worth noting that I kind of like, there's a sense of needing a right balance in terms of kind of laying out the pieces and being explicit. Because, I mean, when I say I like the show being explicit, and you're right to say that it's nice to have a push and pull where it is ambiguous enough that we can have conversations about it, but also that it's explicit enough that we have some idea what's happening. I think one of the big problems with, say, and again, you're talking about not to get too spoilery for Two Fathers, One Son. I'm like, let's not get too spoilery for the entire 9th season of the show. But one of my issues with, say, the 9th season of the show is that it gets far too explicit in terms of like laying out what's happening. It becomes far too 50s science fiction serial in kind of explaining what's happening and using phrases like super soldier, which are two very silly comic booky words that don't necessarily work well in the context of a gritty 1970s conspiracy thriller homage. I think that like these episodes manage to strike the right balance in terms of being ambiguous and being explicit in terms of what they're doing. And I think actually you're right about one of the interesting things about these elements as they're introduced here. And you're right to mention Two Fathers, One Son, because obviously, you could argue this is almost something of a four-parter, this two-parter and then that two-parter in the 6th season, because obviously a lot of the stuff that's set up here pays off there. And it's interesting that then goes away after that point. And again, this is very hard to do without getting spoilery, but there are elements that are introduced in Patient X and the Red and the Black which would seem to be seismic, and I don't even want to say world changers because the scale is so large, universe changers to a certain extent, but it appears like they magically disappear at some point between the middle of the 6th season and the start of the 8th season. And the show doesn't necessarily know what to do with them, which again is something that the show kind of defines the show to a certain extent. It's the way in which the show is written. So I'm not, I'm not going to be overly critical of it. I understand that it's just a result of the process, which is Carter has a great idea. Carter works the great idea into a script. Carter plays with the great idea until he finds another great idea to play with. But there is a sense that, not necessarily all of the elements here. And again, this is kind of strange for all that, like, you're right that Carter is getting explicit and nailing down a mythology and pointing the show in a direction to pay off, roughly a year down the line, less than a year down the line, because it was the November sweeps, wasn't it? Patient X, the Red and Blacks?
Yeah.
Or was it?
March.
Oh, so it was a year. So exactly a year down the line, he's setting up these ideas to pay off. But even, that despite that, these ideas will be allowed to then drift off into the atmosphere, and people will be like, you watch the revival and nothing that happened in Patient X and the Red and the Black really matters at all, except maybe the introduction of Jeffrey Spender. It is an interesting kind of push and pull between the two. I don't mind it, and again, this is the thing where I may be giving the show a little bit too much pretentious-y credit, where it's like, hey, the war in heaven, it's that thing that you can't define. It exists beyond human reckoning. So therefore, it's entirely, reasonable for us to deal with this massive game changer entirely off screen. Because it's beyond your comprehension. But I can give it an out in that sense, and I can kind of go with that idea. I can accept that, these 4 episodes, this 2-parter and the 2-parter in the 6th season, are the only point at which the human experience in big, pretentious, inverted commas happen to overlap with or intersect with exactly what is happening for the colonists in these episodes. Yeah.
Oh, without a doubt, yeah. So I think that other than that, really, that we've brought into Krychek, we've briefly talked about Cassandra, but I think that Veronica Cartwright actually, as people will be aware, that she actually was Lambert in the film Alien. I think she was nominated for an Emmy in this episode, and I think that's rightly so. But we do have 2 new characters in Cassandra and Jeffrey, and you were saying about how Jeffrey's kind of brought in for potentially as a replacement, but
rumored
to be. So Cassandra, a couple of things that I noted on here with Cassandra is that you mentioned a couple of things with you say the show being criticised and the fetus being taken away from her, and one thing that came out of the Cassandra conversations was these people are being called, that Scully ends up being called, that Cassandra ends up being called, that they are, Mulder quite rightly points out that they're from the Mutual UFO Network and they've got these implants in the back of the neck, and you've mentioned obviously about the use of women in the show as well. But the juxtapose that with what she actually says with the fetus, then in the change round where she's saying that good, it's a blessing, it's a calling, rather than being anything evil, which is kind of a weird jumping off point. But I'm guessing that would be from the criticism of the show. But what did you think of the as I say, bringing in this almost haunting calling, which again Mark Snow does really well at, and then finally, just as we talked in towards the end of the episode here, the some of the sound design at the very end with the spaceship, and then the screams that we fade to black into.
Yeah, I mean the thing with Cassandra, and actually kind of was quite impressed rewatching it this time, is how I think that Cartwright's really good in the role, and I can completely understand why she got an Emmy nomination as a guest star outside of that thing where the Emmys tend to nominate like old actors who they feel haven't been properly recognised and have maybe been given kind of a guest spot in a show. Like you'll often see the guest star category at the Emmys is kind of given over, and the supporting actor category, as we move more towards serialization, tends to be given to actors and actresses who the Academy tend to think have been sort of shortchanged as a way of recognizing them if they've never kind of gotten the center stage attention. Like Cartwright has been phenomenal. She's a great actress. She's done a lot of really good work. You mentioned Alien is perhaps the kind of highlight in terms of geek culture, and I think what this is sort of alluding to in the way that she's cast and the way in which she's used, obviously in terms of like sci-fi history. But she is very, very good here. I really like how Cartwright kind of plays her kind of like committedness to it. It's like when Mulder says, "Oh, I think the government may have been responsible for your abduction." It's like, "Oh, I know, they're definitely." Or even things where he's like, "Well, we need to investigate." It's like, "Oh, we don't have time for that," which is great. The sort of no nonsenseness of Cassandra. In terms of the calling, actually, again, this gets back to the kind of, again, pretentious-y stuff that Darren loves about this episode. I love when Carter just commits to this stuff, where it's this kind of mythic quality, because obviously her name is Cassandra. She's a prophet. Yeah. She's been saying, and again, she's been saying the truth but has been misinterpreted. And again, the irony of this particular version of Cassandra is that she herself has misinterpreted it. As you pointed out, she's mistakenly believes that these aliens are here to help mankind, to usher in a new era. And again, I think that you're right that that's the show playing with kind of criticism, playing with the idea that, the show is removing critical thought from these sorts of, from people who have belief in these sort of conspiracy theories and these sort of things, because the show is making the point that actually, if you didn't have any critical thought, you would behave exactly like Cassandra does, where you would assume that, well, this alien that, tore a fetus from your body, but you think are here to help mankind, implies that maybe critical thought isn't necessarily being applied kind of there in a rational sense. But you have that wonderful irony where Cassandra herself doesn't see the truth that she's telling, but where other people don't believe her truth. Where obviously, where Mulder, who believes anything, is due to where he is in his story arc, blinded to the truth that she's offering. And that sort of calling has an almost kind of, mythical quality to it. The idea of being kind of summoned and driven. And again, that wonderful sort of existential quality to it as well, where she's talking with Scully, where Scully comes to visit her, and she says, you feel it, don't you? The calling to a place that you don't know where you're going, or you don't know what it means, but you feel that primal calling. And that's a wonderful expression, for me at least, of like what faith is to a certain extent, of what belief is, of what having something inside you that responds to a call that you don't necessarily literally hear, but also that you don't understand in a way that you kind of cognitively understand the idea of, speech or reading or the word, in a sense of like having some profound sense within yourself that there is a purpose or a calling or a belief, which again ties into this whole kind of, mythic quality that Mulder kind of outlines in the opening, monologue, where he's talking about how the idea that we created gods in order to explain these things. We created mythologies in order to explain these things. And again, the X-Files, we call the serialized story arc at the heart of the X-Files, we call it the mythology. And, there's a sense of that being an explanation for it being a serialized single story, but it also kind of the way in which it plays with ideas that are sometimes Campbellian, such as, Mulder's relationship with his father and the journey that he goes on, which is, to a certain extent recognizable as a hero's journey, but which also then has these sort of elements to it where it is more kind of primal and kind of more strong. And yeah, the closing scene, I'm trying to think actually. The closing scene where the screams, the sound design is absolutely amazing in the episode. Yeah. Mark Snow's score is fantastic. And I remember actually it's really unsettling. And again, this is a really unsettling episode of television, particularly for a mythology episode, because, normally we don't necessarily associate the mythology episodes. They are unsettling, but they're not always the scariest episodes of the show. We tend to think of like standalone episodes like Irresistible, for example, as kind of like the really scary episodes of the X-Files. But here you have Dimitri, obviously, who's scary, but you have that closing sequence with the to be continued fade to black, but where you can hear the screaming playing out over it in a way that is really unsettling. Even when I watched it today, is really unsettling. You cut to black, but you can still hear the sounds, which is very, very uncomfortable. It reminds me a lot of Millennium, where there's a similar sort of effect where the stuff that you don't see or the stuff that is shown to you in Frank's flashes is arguably more unsettling than anything that is actually depicted with a fixed kind of camera staring at, the literal crime scene. It's more unsettling to have the impression of what's happening than what's happening. I'm trying to think, is there another example of that in the show's run? Is there an example of where that kind of we fade to black and we get a sound continuing to play over it that isn't Mark Snow's score?
I don't know. I'm trying to think of anything that comes off the top of my head I don't think so. I'm not 100% sure, but I don't think so.
Okay, but yeah, it is. It's a very, very effective sequence.
Going back to what you were saying, those type of sound designs. There's a particular show which I always revert back to where the BBC had it. I think it's MI5 in America.
Spooks.
But it was known as. But yes.
Where understandably, not called Spooks in America. Apparently, they had to explain that to the BBC.
Where Lisa Faulkner's character in, I think it was the second episode where she was
the chipper, the
yeah.
Sorry, not to spoil it for people.
I'm going to spoil it right now. So the second episode, she was expected to be the lead, and they had her in a kitchen, and the BBC had the highest number of complaints that they've ever had because of people believing that they'd seen Lisa's head being stuck into a fat fryer. And that wasn't what happened. It was the fact that you could hear the sound design and it was never shown, but people believed it. And I think that one of the X-Files did really well in early seasons for doing that, and that's just another perfect example of what you can do with sound design that makes it that. And I always think when I heard this episode at the end of there that I had that kind of visceral reaction that you feel like you're there, and it's your imagination at play there. And I think that's for season 5 of the show, not to show that at that point and to leave it as a cliffhanger, I think is one of the most effective cliffhangers they've done.
Yeah. It also reminded, and again, this is just recency bias here, but I don't know if you watch Mr. Robot. But Mr. Robot, the last episode to air as we record this, which is the penultimate episode ever, does a similar sort of trick with its own kind of closing credits, where the audio continues to play over the closing credits instead of the soundtrack or instead of a musical cue, and it's very, very effective for that.
Yeah. The only thing I'd say for this episode is just one final thing just towards the end of that episode. I know I'm jumping around a little bit, but it's just something that came to mind now, was the way that Manners directs, because I think we've mentioned the centre frame for the New York scene, but right at this end, before Scully does get the call in, we get the phone call from Marisa that she's with Dimitri, and while Mulder's on the phone, Scully disappears, and I think that's a wonderful little scene that just to bring us into the closing credits as well. So I think Kim Manners, as always, did a absolutely wonderful job with this.
It does indeed, and there's again the wonderful thing about that closing sequence is the way in which as an audience, you know that people are cleaning house. You know that something is happening at these abduction sites that is horrific and brutal, because obviously you open in Kazakhstan, former Soviet Union. You've seen the aftermath of what's happening at these gatherings. But one of the things that's really effective, and again, a large part of this down to Mark Snow's score, but also the way in which the camera moves, because they have that wonderful location by the dam with the bridge and with those two streetlights on it, and the way the camera sort of comes down to it and kind of finds it. It's almost like this magical kind of Close Encounters of the Third Kind sequence. And you because of what you've seen in the episode, that this is not going to end well. But there is something almost magical that you kind of suspend disbelief for a second, which makes the inevitable arrival and sense of dread and chaos and screaming all the more horrifying, because it's juxtaposed with something that nominally looks happy and nominally looks magical. Again, you have street lamps that look like they could be from Mary Poppins on the bridge, which is a lovely touch. True.
I've thought that subconsciously today, that, as I say, the score is very kind of light at that point as well. It's almost, euphoric in some ways, isn't it? It has that feeling of, there's awe and wonderment, and, and as I say, that you go from a musical score to the screams, and I think that's a really decent, as I say, juxtaposed the two, and I think that it really works. And any final thoughts before we bring this episode to a close, and we'll catch everyone next week?
No, just it's really, really, really good. I really, really love this episode, and again, I think a large part of why it works, and maybe we didn't talk about it as much as I thought we might have, but is that juxtaposition of like the Carter existential philosophy stuff, the stuff that people, myself included, would refer to as purple prose, with a very propulsive story. Because again, like you have like even the existence of Dimitri as something of a MacGuffin, as something that all the characters want and are chasing. But even that thing that you described as the call, the calling, Cassandra talking to Scully about like feeling that calling, but the abductees being drawn back to Skyland Mountain. They all give this episode a sense of propulsion, which, and again, I know people love the Redux trilogy, and I really like the Redux trilogy. If you listen to me talk about it, but I do think that it is somewhat flawed. I do think that Redux 1 and Redux 2 are somewhat weighed down by Carter's kind of purple prose and maybe a lack of a central drive that some of the best mythology episodes have. And I think that what makes Patient X, and take a swig here in your Patient X X-Cast episode sort of drinking game, but what makes Patient X and the Red and the Black so effective is the way in which they manage to wed that sort of like Carter philosophical kind of approach to the X-Files to a propulsive story with very clear and very real stakes and motivations for everybody involved. It is like no episode but Nicene 731, my platonic ideal of what an X-Files mythology two-parter should be. That's my closing thought. Yeah, no,
I would agree with that. As I say, it's taken me a while to get there over the years, but the more I think about this episode and the more I view it, the more I actually have a much love and appreciation for it. I think that you're right; it blends the two perfectly well. You have elements that he's tried before in other episodes that aren't mythology, things like Syzygy, for example, where he has brilliant lines that are placed in there that are poetic and ethereal and thematic that can sometimes either overshadow the episode or not really work. Then you've got likes of the new revival where it's literally exposition.
This episode will be mostly montage.
Yeah, exactly. Let's have a montage, but yeah, I agree. I think that having the mixture of the two, something that I think he may well have defined in Millennium Season 1, that he's really picked up a lot of work in there that's gone into Season 5. I think has been good, and I think that Season 5 overall has this more collectiveness about it compared to, and I would argue as much as it's kind of redefined, going back to more of a Season 3 element, where Season 4 is a bit messy, but you've got Season 5 is stronger than I still think Season 3 is better in my opinion, but Season 5 does feel stronger for its element than obviously Season 8 coming up in a few years' time that we're going to do. But yeah, so overall, I think personally, I think it's been an episode which I was asked a few, maybe I'd say about a year ago, and there was some round tables that were going on, and one of the questions was, which episode do you think that you've most redefined in your, revalued and what you think has changed the most in your opinion? And I didn't really have an opinion, but I do think, after thinking about it for over a year, that I think this episode would be the one, because I think that, as you say, it has its propulsion, but it's got this visceral reactionary stuff with everything that's gone on with the fire and the rebels and everything else that's going on. But as you say, as this thematic approach as well with the war in factions, and then obviously we'll talk about the Patient X and the Red and the Black. The Red and Black obviously broadens that out into a more of a universal concept, and we'll deal with that next week. Thank you very much for coming back on to speak to us about this episode, Darren.
Absolute pleasure.
where can people find you online? What are you up to at the moment?
Perfect. All right, so you can find me online at Darren_Mooney on Twitter. I write reviews and film coverage and occasional television coverage at The Movie Blog with a 0 instead of an O in movie because I didn't register that quick enough, damn it. But you can also, I co-host a podcast called The 250 with my good friend Andrew Quinn, where we take a look at the IMDb's top 250 movies of all time. Basically one movie at a time, 1 week at a time. So yeah, you can find me online there and feel free to give me a shout. Tweet me, at me, let me know how wrong I am about things. But no, generally speaking, I'm quite happy to engage and have discussions and to chat X-Files and Millennium and pop culture in general.
Fantastic. Well, you can find me, Kurt. I'm on Twitter at rmuldrake. It's RMULDRAKE. You can also find me over on the sister podcast to this one, which is the Time Is Now Pod, which is the Time Is Now podcast, and the Twitter handle is the Time Is Now Pod. That covers the spin-off show Millennium, as we've briefly discussed on this episode here. We, at the time, will probably be coming back to season 2 coverage. We've had a break over the last couple of months, so we'll be coming back to season 2 coverage for that. So that's the best place to find me. But until next time, everyone, trust no one.
The Xcast, an X-Files podcast, is produced and hosted by Tony Black, alongside a dedicated team of podcasters and X-Files fans. You can find the show on Twitter at the X_cast, on Facebook by typing in the Xcast, or inside our group, the X-Files Basement, an Xcast podcast fan group, plus on Instagram by typing in the XFcast. If you're a fan of the show, why not support us on Patreon? Exclusive bonus episodes, early access to new episodes, plus become part of our Xcast community in the Patreon department. To see our monthly subscription options, just head to patreon.com/the Xcast. That's patreon.com/the Xcast. We'd love to see you join our Patreon community. We're also part of the We Made This podcast network at We Made This Pod on Twitter and We Made This on Facebook. You can find a range of shows on TV, film, music and popular culture in general on the network. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.